Hello, I'm Tim Huxley, Executive Director of the Asia Office of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Singapore. Good evening to all of you in the Asia Pacific region. Good afternoon to those in Europe and the Middle East, and good morning to those in the Americas. I'd like to say welcome to the more than 200 participants we have in this webinar launch for the 2020 IISS Asia Pacific Regional Security Assessment. I'll be co-chairing the webinar launch of the 2020 IISS Regional Security Assessment, RSA as we call it, with my colleague, Dr. Lin Kwok, from whom you'll be hearing shortly. The volume that we're launching today is the 7th annual edition of the Asia Pacific Regional Security Assessment. We normally launch the RSA at the start of the annual IISS Shangri-La Dialogue. We've intentionally timed this webinar so that it coincides more or less exactly with what would have been the start of this year's Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. We've invited as guests many of those who would have been delegates to the Shangri-La Dialogue if we'd been able to convene it this year. The publication of this year's Asia Pacific Regional Security Assessment is an important indication that despite the Shangri-La Dialogue itself not being convened, the Shangri-La Dialogue process in more general terms continues nevertheless. The 2020 RSA includes 11 chapters on diverse themes relating to the key regional security issues, ranging from the Sino-American relationship to Indonesian policy in the South China Sea to Europe's role in regional security. I'm delighted that a number of the authors who wrote chapters for this regional security assessment are with us on an expert panel for this launch. They are Bonnie Glaser, Brendan Taylor, and Christopher W. Hughes from Warwick University, all long-standing associates of the IISS, and from the research staff of the Institute itself, Douglas Barry, Aaron Connolly, and Ewan Graham. As in previous years, this year's regional security assessment includes not only in-depth narrative analyses of some of the most important challenges to Asia-Pacific security, but also, like other IISS strategic dossiers, a wealth of data in graphical form. This is a map from Chapter 2 showing the ranges of selected Chinese missiles. And here, from Chapter 3, a table illustrating selected agreements relating to the United States alliances and security partnerships in the region. I'll now hand over to my good colleague from the IISS Asia Office, Dr. Lin Kwok, who is one of our 2 Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellows for Asia Pacific Security, and Lin will introduce the panel in more detail. Over to you, Lin.
Thanks so much, Tim. A very warm welcome to everyone joining us today. I joined the IISS full-time in January and had looked forward to welcoming many of you to the Shangri-La Dialogue today. I'm thus delighted that so many could join us online for the RSA launch. Today we are joined by 6 authors who contributed to the regional security assessment. They've each been asked to make a few remarks before I open the floor to questions. Now, peace and stability in the region will rise and fall on the back of US-China relations. So I'm very pleased to call on our first speaker, Bonnie Glaser, to speak to this issue. I'm sure Bonnie is familiar to many of you. She's Senior Advisor for Asia and Director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Good morning, Bonnie. Thank you so much for joining us so early in your morning. Over to you.
Well, good morning, Lynn and Tim. It's a privilege to have the opportunity this morning to join the panel and, of course, to contribute to this year's really terrific volume, RSA 2020. The trajectory in the US-China relationship was decidedly negative when I wrote this chapter toward the end of 2019. Developments since then have accelerated the downward slide. The coronavirus pandemic, which could have provided the basis for cooperation, instead has driven US-China ties to new lows. Going forward, the US presidential election campaign is likely to further this downward spiral. The current tensions in US-China relations are unlike the past, when there were periods of friction or stalemate and occasional crises that were often followed by improved relations. Differences between the United States and China are structural and they are deeply rooted. Strategic rivalry will be the dominant factor in the US-China relationship for years and perhaps decades to come. The competition is comprehensive, extending to technology, space, cyber, and ideological realms. And the ideological element, from my perspective, has become especially prominent, with the United States under the Trump administration distinguishing at every opportunity the Chinese Communist Party from the Chinese people. And Xi Jinping, for his part, has stated that socialism will triumph over capitalism. Intensifying friction in US-China relations in the absence of effective dialogue mechanisms has far-reaching implications for the Indo-Pacific. The risk of military conflict over Taiwan continues to grow. Chinese foreign policy is becoming more aggressive, in part due to domestic factors, but also because maintaining stability in relations with Washington is less salient for Beijing than it was when the relationship was more amicable. The precipitous decline in America's global reputation and withdrawal from positions of leadership has created new opportunities for Xi Jinping to enhance China's role as a global leader. And we can see that the Trump administration's latest announcement of withdrawal from the World Health example is just one example where China can step into the vacuum. Countries in the Indo-Pacific have reacted to escalating US-China competition with varying combinations of hedging and balancing, and in some cases, bandwagoning. Each nation's preferred strategy depends on numerous factors: their history, geography, their economic profile, and of course, perception of risks. Regional states want to reap benefits from the opportunities presented by China's economic power and seek to avoid having to choose between Washington and Beijing. They oppose a purely confrontational posture toward China, opting instead to manage differences through dialogue and to balance competition with cooperation on matters of common interest, such as non-traditional security issues. Many countries welcome elements of the Trump administration's pushback against China's growing assertiveness, but most prefer to voice their support privately, lest they antagonize Beijing and invite retaliation. A noteworthy trend is the growing collaboration among middle powers in rebalancing regional power dynamics to protect their interests. And I think that as we go forward, middle power cooperation is something to watch, as I believe both China and the United States will take hits for in their global reputation from the global pandemic. We have seen other countries like Australia, South Korea, even Taiwan doing far better in countering the spread of the pandemic. And perhaps this will enable them to step forward in the future, some of those countries, perhaps unilaterally or collectively, to find ways to protect their interests going forward. And I'll stop there, Lynn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. I think one emerging area of competition between the United States and China has been missile deployment. Douglas Berry, who will be joining us next, He will be speaking about the implications of the collapse of the INF Treaty for security in Asia. Douglas Berry is the Senior Fellow for Military Aerospace at the IISS, where he's responsible for the Institute's military aerospace analysis. Douglas, please.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Good day, everybody. Thank you for joining. First of all, by way of thanks to my co-authors on this paper, Mia Nunes, who's a research fellow for Chinese defence policy, military modernisation at the Institute, and also Michael Ellerman, who's the Director of Non-Proliferation and Nuclear Policy, again at the Institute. Now, perhaps at first glance, a chapter on the implications of the end of a treaty between the US and what was the USSR, now Russia, and what's more, a treaty focused on Europe, might appear to sit oddly within the Asia-Pacific regional assessment. But if the collapse of the INF Treaty, that is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, was unwelcome and potentially destabilising for Europe, the loss of the treaty threatens an even worse impact in the Indo-Pacific. Now, the 1987 treaty prohibited the US and the USSR, obviously now Russia, from fielding ground-launched systems with ranges of between 500 and 5,500 kilometres. It was a milestone in US-Soviet rapprochement. It collapsed because the US and its NATO allies were convinced that the Russians had developed and deployed a missile, a ground-launched cruise missile, which was a major breach of the treaty. The system known in the West as the SSC-8 Screwdriver. Now, it's a claim that Moscow continues to deny. So why does this matter in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific context? And here I'll take up where Bonnie left off, and that is the deterioration in ties between Beijing and Washington. How the post-INF environment plays out, I think, could really exacerbate what is already a pretty fractious relationship. Now, the US would like to move beyond bilateral strategic arms control and has talked about trilateral relationships, if not more, US, Russia, China. There is an issue here for China, however, in that nearly all of its ballistic missile and ground-launched cruise missiles sit within that previously prohibited 500 to 5,500 kilometre range category. DF-11, DF-16, DF-21 and DF-26 ballistic missiles, the DF-17 hypersonic boost glide system, the CJ-10 and the CJ-100 cruise missiles all sit in those range categories. In ballistic missile terms, that's pretty much most of China's arsenal, excepting a very limited number of ICBMs. Now, the US views China's ballistic missile arsenal in narrow terms as placing it at a disadvantage. The end of the INF potentially allows it, should it wish, to address this. And we've already seen testing of ground-launched cruise missiles and indeed a ballistic weapon in that category that places it in what was the old INF threshold. I think any move on the part of the US to offset what it sees as this disadvantage by deploying either ground-launched ballistic or cruise missiles into the region would would provoke a response from Beijing, which would be pretty much to the detriment of regional security. And if that wasn't challenge enough, I think that both obviously have the potential, in the case of China, it's on the brink of fielding hypersonic boost glide vehicles that simply complicate the matter yet further. I'll leave it there, Lynn. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Doug. The next speaker will be Professor Brendan Taylor from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. He will be providing us with his assessment of the prospects for a diplomatic solution on the Korean Peninsula.
Thanks very much, Lynn, and congratulations to you and Tim on the launch of the 2020 RSA. And I know that a tremendous amount of work has gone into it, and that really does show in the the finished product, and it's generally been both a privilege and a pleasure to have been involved. My chapter in the RSA is entitled Diplomacy in North Korea, and the chapter does three things. It starts off by documenting the ongoing regional and international challenges posed by North Korea's Kim Jong-un regime. Now, it's easy to lose sight of the North Korean challenge, of course, amidst the range of other curveballs that 2020 has thrown us. And yet Pyongyang has continued to quietly advance its conventional, its cyber, its nuclear, and most importantly, its missile capabilities, even in the face of these. In one of 2020's few bright spots to date, Kim has yet to unveil the new strategic weapon he threatened he would late last year, and which most analysts took to mean a new class of intercontinental ballistic missile. However, the North has continued testing its newest short-range missiles, the KN-23, the KN-24, and the KN-25. And just this March, it conducted no less than 8 short-range missile tests, the most during a single month in the country's history. Last October, it also successfully tested a new submarine-launched ballistic missile, the Pukgoksong-3. The second thing I do in the chapter is to analyse how and why diplomatic responses have weakened in the face of this growing North Korean challenge. Now, the demise of Korean Peninsula diplomacy has certainly been swift, especially when one thinks back to those heady days of January 2018, when Kim's younger sister, Kim Yo-jong, attended the Winter Olympics in South Korea. 3 inter-Korean summits followed, producing tangible results, including some promising military confidence building measures. In the chapter, however, I show how South Korea's leader, Moon Jae-in, has gradually been frozen out of Korean Peninsula diplomacy. I also describe the rise and demise of US-North Korean summitry, starting with the historic June 2018 Trump-Kim summit in Singapore, and ending with the failed working-level Stockholm talks of last October. Both sides, it seems, have simply been unable to agree upon what denuclearization means, or over whether North Korean denuclearization or sanctions relief should come first. The third thing I do in the chapter is to highlight how China has been the major beneficiary of these developments, to the point where Xi Jinping has arguably now assumed the mantle of chief mediator in Korean Peninsula diplomacy. Now, this too marks a significant shift. During the first half decade of their respective rules, Kim and Xi never met and reportedly didn't particularly like one another, but they've now met 5 times. So where to from here? Unfortunately, as we look out over the next 12 months, one can see 2 quite ominous trends. And first, the first one of those really reinforces, I think, some of Bonnie's opening remarks. If we look back historically, Korean Peninsula diplomacy has traditionally relied upon US-China cooperation. But with the prospects for such cooperation now looking particularly grim, that's something that we can no longer rely upon going forward. Secondly, North Korea has also in the past arguably relied upon various provocations, nuclear or missile tests, for example, as a way of grabbing international attention and to force major powers, most notably the US, to sit down with it at the negotiating table. But given the raft of competing global and regional challenges, Kim Jong-un is going to have to do something really dramatic if he is going to successfully employ such tactics again today. Watch this space.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Our next speaker will be looking at Japan's security role in the region. I think this links back to Bonnie Glaser's point earlier about how the role of middle powers in the region is certainly something that's going to be growing and going to become more important. Professor Christopher Hughes will examine Japan's security role in the region. He is Pro-Vice Chancellor of Education and Professor of International Politics and Japanese Studies at the University of Warwick. Please, Professor Hughes.
Thanks very much, Lynn. Yes, so as Lynn said, I was interested to talk about Japan and Indo-Pacific security. I mean, really what the chapter does is it tries to sort of look at developments in Japan's foreign security policy and the trajectory overall of where Japan is heading. But there's also a strong element to the chapter which really looks at what you could call perhaps a kind of net assessment of where Prime Minister Abe Shinzo has got to in his agenda around security and foreign policy. As we know, he is the longest serving post-war Prime Minister in Japan's constitutional history. And by the time that he gets to the end of his term next year, we'll see if that's the end of his term anyway, he will be the longest serving Prime Minister in Japanese history. So I thought it'd be a useful device to use the chapter just to kind of do a net assessment. So the chapter's really divided into 5 analytical sections. I won't go into too much detail in them, but the first one really looks at Japan's unfolding strategic environment. It looks at Sino-Japanese relations. There has been some recent improvements in relations between Japan and China under Xi and Abe. But as I argue, I think there are deep structural problems in that relationship. And actually, I think we're beginning to see them come back again with recent issues again emerging over maritime security, territorial disputes, and Japan's criticism of China's actions around Hong Kong. I look at North Korea, which I think is always a constant irritant for Japan. Its missile nuclear programs, but actually really the main problem always posed for Japan by North Korea is the risk of decoupling from the relationship with the United States. I talk about the very worrying kind of downturn in Japan-South Korea relations. Again, issues of history and territory spilling over into that relationship and into the security relationship. I talk about Japan's frustrated attempts really to try and bring Russia on side as a potential counterweight to China, but again, how Japan has been frustrated in those efforts. And then I look crucially at the US-Japan relationship. Japan has attempted to move closer to the Trump administration. We can see that through sponsoring the FOIP concept to enhance defense procurement from the United States, but still the same security dilemmas remain for Japan over abandonment by Trump in the case of North Korea, or possible entrapment in the Iranian nuclear dispute, and more generally Trump's questioning of the future utility of the alliance. So based on this strategic assessment of Japan's security environment, then I start to move in to look at recent developments in Japan's security policy and military frameworks under Abe. I mean, I think it's very clear to say that Abe has moved quite a long way in terms of strengthening his domestic position. That's allowed him to do all kinds of things in terms of pushing forward his foreign and security policy agenda. Although I think COVID-19, ironically, might be one of his greatest problems domestically rather than any kind of domestic political opposition. I look at the reform of Japan's security institutions, how Abe has continued to overturn various taboos in terms of Japan's defense policy. And then, for me, I think very crucially, 2 major changes in terms of Japan's beginning to overturning its ban on the exercise of collective self-defense, and then very importantly, the revision of the US-Japan defense guidelines and the expansion of functional geographic cooperation between the 2 allies. I then move on, and there's a section on Japan's evolving defense program and capabilities. Again, I won't go into great detail, but I look at some of the procurements and how this is enhancing Japan's ability as an individual military actor, but also as an ally of the United States. I then look more generally at Japan's regional diplomacy, a little bit outside the scope of the US-Japan alliance in terms of it's trying to develop some key relationships with Australia, India, and some individual ASEAN states, and how this is also buttressing a kind of, if you like, sort of a network or a sort of proto-quasi-alliance relationships in the region. And then the final section of the chapter looks at Japan's economic diplomacy and how that Japan is embarking on that in order to try and counter Chinese influence in the region. In terms of the conclusion and the net assessment of Abe, I think really what I argue is that I think Abe has been very significant over the last 8 to 9 years. He has demonstrated very significant vision and dynamism. I think where we've seen most success is in Japan's national security program and in terms of the upgrading of the US-Japan alliance. Some progress in economic diplomacy, but I think Japan's diplomatic and security position is still quite perilous. As I said, I think relations with China are probably due for a further downturn. Japan is rather isolated as a player on the Korean Peninsula. We've seen that very worrying downturn of ties with South Korea and really no movement in terms of Japan's relations with Russia. So in some ways, Japan is, even though it's been very active it's possibly back at square one in terms of where it stands, in terms of the kind of the real extant regional problems that Japan faces. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much. I think what's very interesting, so you seemed quite pessimistic about Japan's role in the region. What I found quite interesting is a recent Institute IC's study, wherein I think over 60% of respondents thought that Japan could be counted upon to do the right thing, contrasted to just 30% thinking the United States would do the right thing, and perhaps about 16%, if my memory serves me correctly, thinking that China would do the right thing. So by and large, I mean, this particular poll suggested that Japan, perhaps by its economic diplomacy, appears to be doing quite a good job in the region, in Southeast Asia at least. My next speaker will actually be looking at Southeast Asia. That's my colleague, Aaron Connolly. He is research fellow in Southeast Asian political change and foreign policy at the IISS in Asia. He will examine whether Indonesia, which is by far the largest country in Southeast Asia, is poised to reprise its role as a significant security actor in the region. Aaron, please.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks for the question. You know, Indonesia's foreign policy since President Joko Widodo took office in 2014 has really been characterized by a step back from the energetic diplomacy that we saw under his predecessor, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, from 2004 to 2014. And in particular, SBY's second-term foreign minister, Mari Nadalegawa. SBY approached diplomacy, he sort of branded his approach summit diplomacy. And he was, you know, he bid for the APEC chairmanship. He sought to host ASEAN earlier in the cycle than they would have hosted it otherwise. And he was an enthusiastic participant in the G20, which Indonesia joined the first leaders summit in 2008. But when President SBY was about to leave office, there was a critique of Indonesian diplomacy in Indonesia, of SBY in particular, that this had all been a little bit of an ego trip and that it hadn't really delivered any tangible gains for the Indonesian people. And so when Jokowi ran for president in 2014, he was running against General Prabowo Subianto, but he was also kind of running against the record of his predecessor, making the case that he would engage in foreign policy in a more down-to-earth way. And in fact, that is the branding that he's chosen for his foreign policy, diplomacy membumikan, down-to-earth diplomacy. And so he's eschewed the summits, and he actually had to be convinced to attend the G20 APEC, and he occasionally leaves ASEAN early. So it's really been a step back from SBY. My chapter looks at Indonesia's relationship with China against that backdrop, and concludes that Indonesia has really been deferential to Beijing in a number of areas. So for example, when Jokowi came to office, one of the issues he was very interested in tackling, and it was very popular politically in Indonesia, was illegal fishing. And there was a particular problem with Vietnamese and Chinese illegal fishing in Indonesia's archipelagic territorial waters and exclusive economic zone. And Indonesia embarked on a campaign of sinking foreign fishing vessels that were found in Indonesian waters. But of the 556 fishing vessels that Indonesia sunk during the first term of Jokowi, 57% were Vietnamese vessels. Only 3, not 3%, only 3 were Chinese vessels. So it's an example of how Jokowi had been deferential to China on something that was a key interest of his administration. And we also saw with the arbitral tribunal ruling in The Hague in 2016, Indonesia was very reluctant to cite the arbitral tribunal's ruling, even though it very clearly supported Indonesia's position in the South China Sea, and in particular its sovereignty around the Natuna Islands. And it only did that on December 31st of last year. And it's done it again last week in a diplomatic note, actually a note verbal in New York. But it's something that it's been very reluctant to bring up until this point. And there are some other examples as well, but if I just focus specifically on the South China Sea, which is really the main focus of my chapter, Jokowi has stood up against Chinese incursions into what Indonesia regards as its exclusive economic zone around the Natuna Islands. And in fact, he's stood up very publicly. He's flown out to Natuna now 3 times. He's the first Indonesian president to visit the Natuna Islands, and he's done it thrice. And he's also made very clear to China that Indonesia regards this as a core interest of his administration. But on the other hand, he's not taken on a role in the broader diplomatic disputes that really characterize the administration of SBY and his foreign minister, Marty Natalegawa. I think this is likely to continue. Indonesia, Jokowi is really preoccupied with domestic politics in Indonesia, and he doesn't have a lot of time to spare for foreign policy. He doesn't regard it as a particularly worthwhile focus of his administration. And if you're looking for sort of evidence of how COVID will affect this, if you look at Indonesia's stance on the World Health Assembly resolution last month, Indonesia, like every other country, ultimately supported the resolution. It was unanimous, but it issued a statement afterwards distancing itself from the Australian effort to form an investigative panel into events, because it didn't want to be seen as less than non-aligned or aligned with the United States and its allies in pursuing an investigation. So I think this is likely to continue.
Thanks, Aaron. My colleague, Dr. Ewan Graham. He is Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Security at the IISS, and he'll be examining the interest and role of Europe in Asia.
So I'm the sixth speaker, and my chapter was the last in the assessment, and perhaps reflective of that, Europe and Asia security relations are not often thought of as particularly dynamic. But I think that's one of the topics that really has been impacted in a very significant way by the pandemic. So rather than reprise my chapter, I thought I'd give a few comments about what I think has changed since. But I think the major point that I made, which still is applies, is that the old way of thinking about Europe's contribution to Asian security is in the form of a contribution, something that Europe voluntarily brings towards Asia in service of almost a duty, sometimes to fulfill an ambition as a global actor in the form of the EU or large member states as well. But that, I think, has been the prevailing model for at least as long as the Shangri-La dialogue has been running. But that's no longer sufficient to capture the complexity of the Asia-Europe security interaction, for the obvious reason that China is now itself present in Europe as a factor bearing on European security in various ways. One significant strategic factor is as a closely aligned partner of Russia, and potentially the formation of a Eurasian power bloc is something that would, of course, deeply perturb European defense and security planners thinking ahead. But China is also present as an economic player, as a welcome source of trade and investment for that matter. But it's also present within Europe in other ways that the modus operandi of the Chinese Communist Party has asserted itself elsewhere, as through political interference, through economic coercion, through espionage, and also through just general corruption. So in that sense, I think one eye in Europe was already open towards this. The pandemic, however, has changed it, because China has engaged in such a full-throated wolf warrior diplomacy, if you can call it diplomacy, campaign. I think it stretched into disinformation as well, that has changed the public dynamic and the political dynamic quite clearly, with a number of member states feeling that they've been targeted. I think France is one example. The UK, of course, no longer in the EU, but the UK's China debate has flipped around very dramatically in just a matter of weeks. And even Sweden, Sweden, if you can think of it as a professionally neutral country, has come off the fence and urged for sanctions to be put through the EU on the Hong Kong national security legislation. So a very significant shift in a very short amount of time. I think for that reason, Asia is going to remain on Europe's radar, but we also have to bear in mind that Europe has been diminished by this, both in material terms by the pandemic. Defense budgets will be impacted by that, and reputationally. I wouldn't want to be the next European senior official who's asked to address an Asian audience to talk about crisis response. It may never recover to where it was. But I think there is still demand from key Asian countries. They see Europe as key to the balance in Asia, not so much in military terms. A lot of our attention goes towards ship deployments, aircraft, and especially aircraft carriers. But I think really Europe counts for maybe a bit more than showing the flag in military terms, but it's not going to swing the balance. It's the balance in much broader sense of offering alternatives in 5G technology, of offering international assistance without strings attached, and generally doing the right thing, saying things in defense of the rules-based order that make it look more international. For example, the South China Sea, so that it's not simply a US-China binary. And I think Asian powers look to Europe as also an easier partner to deal with than the United States, so they don't have to make those exclusive choices. I think for all those reasons, there will still be a pull on the rope for Europe to still be involved, even though it has suffered. That demand is also from the United States, I should add. So the United States wants its partners, NATO and at a bilateral level as well, to be more involved, because I think there's a recognition, even in the United States, that the challenge from China is so large in scale and wide in scope that it can only really be addressed through global balancing. So Europe will play a role in there. My final comment would be from the Asian perspective. Europe is there, but it's also a more disaggregated form of engagement. The UK has left, so there's that extra wrinkle that has to be negotiated. There are internal splits within the EU. And I think the EU itself is, although it makes claims to be a geopolitical actor and a hard security player in Asia, it frankly doesn't really pass the test. And it recalls the analogy used by Singapore's Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan about ASEAN when he said, you can't wish a cow into being a horse. I think something similar can be said about the EU, that it is fundamentally more of a cow than a horse, however much it would like to change its own role. So I think it's rather like the Henry Kissinger telephone test, that still that question applies. Who do Asian leaders pick up and call if you want to talk to Europe? Now it's become a more complicated case than it was previously. So I look forward to your questions, and we'll end there.
Thanks so much. Ian, just one quick question. You mentioned the importance of Europe as a soft power player. To what extent is their strength as a soft power player dependent on them being able to act multilaterally, and seeing how they've responded predominantly on a national basis to COVID? Is talk of multilateralism just as the Dutch Prime Minister once said, singing from the hymn book of multilateralism, but not actually putting it into practice?
I think multilateralism writ large has actually suffered from the pandemic. ASEAN has also taken a significant reputational blow. It's been very inactive in the pandemic. I think the same is true of European multilateralism. But I think when it comes to Asian security, it was never really that important. What we tended to see is that the further the major states, the member states, get from Europe, the more they tend to act according to their national interests, particularly those with long-standing historical ties like France and the UK. They may talk the talk of being a seamless European voice, but in actual fact, they're more often than not, I think, acting independently, maybe congruently, but I think in that sense, it's probably not that damaging. We'll still see the UK and the France. In fact, that competition could play to Asia's favor, because as we saw at the Shangri-La dialogue last year, there's been a running dialogue between France and UK Ministry of Defence counterparts about who could get their aircraft carrier there first, and whether the Brits will actually be able to follow the lead of the French in getting the Charles de Gaulle there last year. Next year is something we'll have to watch and with bated breath.
Thanks so much, Ian. I would like to open the floor now to questions. I think the way that everyone should go about doing this is using the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. So click on it And that will alert our IT team that you would like to ask a question. I will call on the person that they whose mic they should activate, and please thereafter feel free to ask your question. I would be grateful if you could please identify the institute from which you come and keep your comments or questions short and sharp. So let's have a look at could we please have Mr. Mark Champion?
Yes, hello. It's Mark Champion here from Bloomberg. I had a sort of two-part question, if you like. One is, to what extent do the experts think that Asian allies are in a kind of wait-and-see mode at the moment in terms of trying to get business done with the Trump administration and waiting essentially for the November election, given all the turmoil in the US at the moment? Or is that not the case and they're simply, business continues as usual? And, related to that is, looking beyond November, within Europe, a Biden presidency for most of the traditional US allies is seen as a sort of unalloyed good. It wouldn't be any kind of panacea. Things would not go back to the same way the way they were. But there's, it'd be hard to find anyone who would prefer to see Trump remain. Is that the same in Asia, where a Biden presidency would be seen as an unalloyed good?
I think I'll take a couple of questions. Could I have Mr. Andy Tian, please, next?
Thank you, Chair. This is retired Captain Tian from the Grand View Institution based in Beijing, China. I have two questions, two-part questions. One is to Ms. Bonnie Glaser. The other is to Dr. Douglas Berry. For Dr. Glaser, the question is, as the US put forward its new strategic approach toward China and adopt a whole of government approach towards China, we here in China are worried that once opposing China becomes the political norm, there will be an inevitable impact on frontline military operations, where military professionalism is called for in making decisions. With more and more encounters between China and the US in the South China Sea and elsewhere, to what extent do you see the mismanagement of the unprofessional encounters will rise to maritime armed conflict? And also, well-managed Chinese scholars see this US-China rivalry being imposed upon China, and all the alleged assertive actions are responsive to US forward military operations. And I would also like to have your comments. And my final question is to Douglas Berry. I heard from your presentation about the military armament, in particular the missile development in China. There have been long-term criticism on China for modernization of its weapons, whether missiles or aircraft carrier. The simple logic is quite often that the US or allies are within the range of one specific weapon, or the US could not keep an absolute superiority in one military specific area. So the average Chinese people just don't understand why couldn't China develop advanced weapons as long as it does not break its obligation under international law. I would also like to have your comments. Thank you.
Let's first address Mark Champion from Bloomberg's point on whether US allies and partners are adopting a wait-and-see approach. Perhaps we could have Bonnie Glaser address that point first, and then if you'd also like to touch on the Biden presidency, and Aaron, if you could chip in on that as well. And then on the question that Andy Tian asked on unprofessional encounters at sea and the likelihood of maritime conflict, perhaps Ewan, you could chip in, and whoever else would like to speak, please just kind of lift your hand and And I will note that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lynn. This is an important question, but I don't think that any country really has the luxury of waiting out President Trump. South Korea, of course, is engaged in ongoing discussions with the United States about what they will pay for U.S. forces and the base agreements. Japan, going forward, is going to have similar discussions with the United States. Perhaps they would like to postpone those discussions as long as possible. But countries have to make decisions today about their own security. So I think that while there are preparations for both possible outcomes, that there are very few countries, if any, that can really put all of their decisions on hold. Regarding whether or not a Biden presidency is an unalloyed a good for U.S. allies, I think that that probably countries have different views, and some countries are rather ambivalent. I think Japan, for example, while having some problems with the Trump administration, on balance has seen the United States as a very good partner under President Trump, and Prime Minister Abe has probably forged the best relationship with President Trump of all global leaders. That said, there are obviously issues, and he has had to try to duck some problems. And the U.S. undoubtedly has surprised Japan in many ways, perhaps the withdrawal from the World Health Organization just being the latest. Japan had some concerns about U.S. policy under President Obama, particularly policy toward China. And I do think that there are some concerns in Japan about where U.S. policy toward China would go. Would it be in a direction that perhaps would pick up on some of the cooperative elements of the Biden administration? Japan, in some cases, saw the United States as somewhat weak towards China under Obama, and particularly it's the consideration of Xi Jinping's proposal to have a new type of great power relationship, which was ultimately not embraced by Obama, but during the period it was being considered, I think they felt very uneasy. Just to quickly cite another example would be Taiwan, which has benefited greatly from the Trump administration and the strengthening of U.S.-Taiwan relations. They might be concerned about whether under a Democratic administration, there might be more weight given to the U.S.-China relationship. So these are questions they have, no certainty about where Biden policy would be going forward, but I think it varies across the region.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. Brandon, if you could later address the issue of Taiwan and how it views a possible Biden presidency, I think that would be rather interesting. Aaron.
Thanks, Lynn. I think it depends on who you ask in Southeast Asia. There are certainly some leaders like Prayut Chan-o-cha in Thailand and President Duterte in the Philippines who feel as though they get a more sympathetic hearing from the Trump administration than they did from the Obama administration on human rights issues. And President Trump has spoken very highly of leaders who American presidents would not normally speak very, very highly of based on their human rights records. And so there may be some in Southeast Asia who would prefer a Trump presidency continue, but even within these societies and within the bureaucracies and civil service of these countries, there is a sort of continued consternation at what is happening in the United States and at US policy. And so even where there might be some sympathy, especially at the leader level, I think more broadly in Southeast Asia, you see a kind of bewilderment and consternation at US policy under this administration, and a hope that possibly a Biden administration would be more effective or at least more predictable and more competent.
Brandon, so how does Taiwan look at this presidency, and is it at the Trump presidency, and is it unnerved by the prospect of a Biden presidency? Is it looking forward to that, or does it have its best situation ever?
Yeah, no, Lynn, I'd very much agree with Bonnie on this. I mean, during the Obama presidency, there was quite a lot of support for Taiwan, but it was done, much more privately and discreetly. Things like arms sales and transits through the Taiwan Strait, that's become a lot more public. And I'd agree completely with Bonnie that I think that relationship is now the closest it's been really since the normalization of US-China relations in the 1970s. I think the other really interesting question for me is also how North Korea will perceive this. I think there'll be some nervousness in North Korea about the prospect of a Biden presidency. Certainly the relationship between North Korea, as I discussed in the chapter, isn't particularly good at the moment, but the personal chemistry between Trump and Kim largely has been good, and the North Koreans have been quite careful to differentiate between the two, the personal relationship and the relationship between the two countries. If we look back to the Obama presidency, that was a period of strategic patience where the US essentially was just waiting North Korea out. I think a Biden presidency will emphasize human rights issues, as the Democrats traditionally have, more than the Republicans have, and certainly more than the Trump administration has. Having said that, we did see some of the major agreements between the US and North Korea under Democrat administrations, namely the 1994 Agreed Framework and almost a missile deal in the late 1990s between the US and North Korea as well. So never say never, but I think the North Koreans will probably be fairly anxious about the prospects of a Biden presidency.
Interesting. Let's have Yuan answer the question of maritime security, please.
Well, I think we've already seen maritime issues continuing to play out post-pandemic in a way that has been really quite troublesome. But the issue is not, I think, so much in the details of the maritime issues. It's really a question about what that says about China's intent, because that's the interlinking issue here. The really worrisome aspect is that I think China has taken on so many issues, Hong Kong, Taiwan, there's a military standoff with India ongoing across the Himalayan frontier, and we've seen this spate of so-called wolf warrior attacks on unsuspecting countries, including even Austria. So, I mean, one hesitates to see where next I think China would go. I think the debate tends to be about whether it's business as usual or not business as usual. I think in terms of the actual activities that we've seen, I incline toward business as usual, but that business has also been moving progressively further south in the South China Sea. That itself, I think, is a stepping up. And the willingness to take on all comers on all these various fronts at the same time, where you have a major land dispute with a nuclear power such as India, it's really very troublesome. To me, it's this window of strategic alert that we face between now and the US election, and even into the succession period beyond that I'm rather worried about.
I think the points you raise are important, and I believe they're linked to a written question that Gordon Arthur posed earlier. I'll just call on him to make sure that that question has in fact been answered. It was about whether China has become a serious destabilizing player in Asia. So Gordon Arthur.
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, so just to ask that question, and also to discuss further about the India-China border dispute. Why has China chosen this particular time to pursue this confrontation with India? It's all very alarming, quite concerning, the militaristic talk coming from China. So is it likely that we're going to see some kind of shots fired between China and perhaps the USA or some other Asian country? Just interested to get your thoughts.
Thanks very much. The next question will go to Kogila Balakrishnan. Well, Kugila, are you there? I'll call in the next person.
Hello. Hi.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry. I have got two questions to ask. My first question is with regards to middle powers. We keep referring to middle powers, and that's become a buzzword now, and the need to fill in the vacuum that is being left by the United States. So the question is really, who are these middle powers, and do these middle powers really have the resources and capability to take on the leadership? Or is there a need for an alignment between the middle powers and what we refer to as the Indo-Pacific alliances? Could this be the middle powers that we are referring to? And my second question is actually poised to my colleague, Chris. Can Japan and South Korea put their differences aside and their historical legacy and collaborate in the present context where it is vital for these two countries to strengthen their position in the region? Thank you.
The next question goes to Mr. David Finkelstein.
Yes, thank you for my good colleague, Bonnie Glaser. Bonnie, do you have any sense of whether Chinese are hoping for or prepared to initiate a reset in relations with the US under a notional Biden presidency, or have the Chinese just thrown up their hands? Thank you.
And let's take one more, Desmond Bowen.
Hello, and thanks for the presentations. As I think Ewan said, China has not wasted this crisis to further its interests and to put critics and challengers in their place. And I'd just like to revert to Taiwan and ask the question, is this a slow burn crisis ending in 2049, or could it become a critical issue much sooner? Thank you.
Chris, maybe we will have you answer Kugila's question on Japan-South Korea relations first.
Yeah, thanks. Very well. Quite quickly. So it's a great question. I mean, really, on the face of it, of course, Japan and South Korea should be close, very close partners, have common security interests, common economic interests, both democracies in the region, and so on and so forth. But we have seen this downturn, quite serious downturn in relations. I think it's going to be difficult for the time being for the two to kind of restore their relations, because this is where the factor of history, I think, identity, collective memory, and so on come into play. I mean, the Abe administration is, regardless of what some would say, and I think it's, quite deeply revisionist in its outlook. And it's really at loggerheads its view of how the region should be ordered, and Japan's role in the region, and Japan seeing itself as a kind of rules-based power that acts in conformity with international law, upholder of democracy, and so on. That's kind of at loggerheads with, I think, the kind of the South Korean view of Japan as not yet atoning for or sufficiently really trying to resolve historical issues. And again, these issues keep coming back. So I think as long as South Korea and Japan, and certainly the 2015 agreement over comfort women, I think was a very flawed agreement because it didn't really address the underlying issues still there. So I think as long as these history issues are still present, then I think there's going to be a very, very testy relationship, particularly between these two current administrations in Japan and South Korea. But I think once Abe is gone, and if we have a less revisionist outlook in terms of leadership, then we may be able to restore the relationship somewhat.
Thank you. Ewan, did you want to talk about India-China, or?
I actually had a point to make on middle powers, if that's all right.
Sure, of course. Perhaps, actually, just 1 second. Brandon, did you want to talk about India-China?
And I'm fine, and I'll keep my powder dry for Taiwan if that's okay. So.
Oh, that's fine. Because we do have someone in the IISS Asia, and I believe he's on, IISS, and I believe he's online right now. And if Viraj Solanki is around and he would like to address the question on India.
Hi, thanks, Lynn. On India-China relations, Tensions have increased recently after there was an increase in standoffs in several locations along the line of actual control, which separates Indian and Chinese controlled territories on their border, which started a month ago today. And because the line of actual control is undefined and both countries disagree even as to the length of the line of actual control, patrols from both sides' armies go up to their perceived claim lines, and therefore face-offs are usually common, even though there are detailed protocols on how both sides should handle such encounters. However, this is the most serious standoff between the two countries since their armed forces faced off for 73 days on Bhutan's Stockholm Plateau in 2017. And the previous standoffs were more localized, but now there have been standoffs taking place in around 4 locations across different parts of the line of actual control at the same time. And this includes in the Galwan River Valley area, which was previously not disputed. And alongside this, more troops have also been deployed from either side, which makes it different to previous standoffs. And there's uncertainty over the precise size and location of the forces involved and the extent to which Indian and Chinese forces have entered into territory that the other side claims as its own, especially in the Pangong Lake area. But one reason reportedly for this face-off has been an increase in Indian road construction on its side of the border in Ladakh, and India's been upgrading both border roads and infrastructure there, making it easier to send patrols further forward. And therefore, this has been one reason that's been reported for an increase in tensions at the moment, including India's construction of smaller feeder roads going off a main road that was constructed. However, what's been notable is that no shot has been fired across the line of actual control since 1975, and it's unlikely that this will occur in this standoff. Rhetoric has been low on both sides at the official level, even though the exact reasoning for the issues has not been made public at the official level. And there's been recent statements, for example, on the Indian side by the defense minister, as well as by the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, emphasizing how the two sides have established mechanisms at both the diplomatic and military levels to resolve this issue through dialogue. And I think despite this, there's been multiple meetings up to the major general level, and these have not diffused attention. So I think going forward significantly, tomorrow, for the first time during this face-off, there'll be a dialogue at the 3-star lieutenant general level when an Indian corps commander meets his Chinese counterpart, and seeing the outcome of these talks tomorrow will be significant, which are aimed at restoring the status quo, although they may not lead to an immediate resolution of the face-off. Thanks.
Thank you, Viraj. Thanks very much for that. I think I'd like to return to the panelists now to address the question of middle powers. It's a fairly broad question, and I think all of you, if you could address the question of, all of you who'd like to, could address the question of who are these middle powers, and are they able to work alone or collectively to improve the security situation in the region? Shall we start with Ewan?
Thanks, Lynn. I'll try and be brief because I know we've got people who are waiting patiently to ask questions. But I think it is an important question. I look at it through the case study, if you like, of Australia, which is often tagged with this idea of being a middle power caught between great powers. And we've had a recent experiment with taking the call for an inquiry in the teeth of strong opposition from China and ambivalence actually from the United States, and getting maybe a two-star out of 3 result from that. Imperfect, but nonetheless, I think it did show some attempt to try and fill the void. And as analysts, we tend to have a predisposition towards looking at things through perhaps a negative lens in security. I think this is one of the good news stories, frankly, out here at the moment, amidst a blame game and a lot of rock throwing between US and China. We do see actually some substance beginning to form between the middle powers out there on a global scale. One example of that, the UK has decided to lead a 5G technology consortium. We've seen Korea being potentially invited into an expanded G7 format, Australia along with that. I think there's often an assumption that to be effective, multilateralism needs to be the platform, and I'm not so sure about that. I think in this sort of, we're reconstructing the building blocks from zero in some ways post-pandemic, and bilaterals can also be very effective. We've just seen a very interesting outcome from Australia and India holding a virtual summit where there was an agreement across a raft of issues, including defense, but also to supply rare earth minerals. And that bilateral can also be quite effective. It doesn't have to be, I think the old idea of middle power diplomacy is that it had to be a platform in which everyone would get together and meet, and it was a rather vague ambition, but without much collective interest. Now I think we're actually finding that the common challenge of China is becoming the common denominator that's stitching together a lot of activity. One final point, we're also seeing not just states leading this, but a very interesting development with an interparliamentary union. So it's parliaments that are also getting involved in this and beginning to drive it amongst democracy. And I think that's quite a healthy development.
Thank you. Aaron, is bilateralism the name of the game moving forward?
I think in Southeast Asia, there will continue to be a big focus on ASEAN institutions and ASEAN-related institutions. And we have seen some proposals from Malaysia last week and from Indonesia shortly after the Natuna Islands standoff in January for mini-laterals within ASEAN. And this is a kind of a revival of an ASEAN minus structure proposal that we saw several years ago that never really got anywhere. I think the danger to these proposals, and many ASEAN diplomats would tell you this, is that ASEAN consensus actually does carry some weight in this region. And so although you might not get ASEAN consensus most of the time, when you do, it actually holds quite a bit of weight. And we saw ASEAN nearly come to a consensus in 2016, right before the arbitral tribunal ruling, when all the ASEAN foreign ministers went to UC in China and delivered a pretty tough statement to the Chinese foreign minister at the time. And it may have had some effect on how they responded afterwards. So I don't think we'll see quite as much bilateralism in Southeast Asia as we do perhaps in other parts of the world, or even minilateralism. The focus will continue to be on ASEAN-centric institutions.
Chris Hughes?
Sorry, my mic was unmute, was hidden by something else. Yeah, no, I mean, I think Japan, well, I don't think it sees itself as a middle power. But yeah, I mean, it does have certain characteristics, and perhaps that's the way that Japan is heading in some senses in terms of its national capabilities and some of its behavior in the region. I mean, I think we are seeing under the current administration, we are seeing some, I mean, Abe clearly wants to demonstrate that Japan has agency and has a degree of autonomy. So I think, you know, in the economic diplomacy field, I think there's been some very interesting developments around TPP-11 and so on, and Japan doing things which are, in a sense, not just counterbalancing China, but also in a way kind of insulating Japan from some of the economic shocks that the US has been sort of threatening to visit upon Japan. But I still think that Japan, a lot of Japan's, you know, the thrust of what Japan is doing at the moment is very much centered around not trying to build alternative solutions from those of the United States, but in many ways interacting with some of the other middle powers in the region in order to kind of just reinforce and rebuttress the presence of the United States in the region, which is again why I slightly depart from some of the earlier comments about, you know, Japan seeing the US as a kind of predictable or reliable ally. And I think what Japan is trying to do is trying to tie Japan, the United States back into the region. I also think, going back to my earlier comments about, you know, Japan-South Korea relations, I mean, you know, in many ways, you know, I think if you have effective middle power diplomacy, you have to get on with your neighbors. And, you know, the fact that, you know, another middle power, you know, which South Korea is often labelled as, the fact that, you know, it's threatening to take Japan to the World Trade Organization. You have a kind of almost de facto sanctions. You know, the relationship is kind of mired in history problems. I don't think that says a lot for kind of middle power cooperation in the region in some ways. So I think it's a very mixed picture from what Japan is really trying to do.
Doug, did you have anything to add? I had a question on the bilateral multilateralism. Do you think there is potential for a bilateral framework rather than a multilateral framework? So just US and China, would that be sufficient, or do we have to involve other powers as well?
It's very, very difficult to do just in a bilateral sense, partly because given the geography, the ranges are very, very different. And there's actually very little indication that the Chinese would engage in a bilateral deal at the moment at all. So I think it's a big challenge getting the Chinese to engage on this.
Thank you. Brandon, you talked in your excellent book about Taiwan being one of the flashpoints. And in fact, Taiwan is often seen as a flashpoint. But do you think Taiwan can play, what sort of constructive role can Taiwan play in the broader, you know, balance or push for a rules-based order in the region?
I mean, I should put my cards on the table, Lynn, and say that I'm you know, pretty skeptical about the role that middle powers can play, and that might sound a bit strange coming from someone sitting here on a Friday evening in Canberra. But I think a lot really depends on what the United States does, and I think it's important for us not to overestimate what the middle powers are able to do, particularly in the absence of the US. And I'm thinking in terms of its, you know, just the sheer material power of the US, a country that still spends $700 billion a year or more on its defense. And I think also that the convergence of interest or the lack thereof between those middle powers is also something to bear in mind. So while I'm certainly not expecting the US to withdraw from Asia, I think if that were to happen under a worst case scenario, potentially a worst case scenario, I think that it's important for us to be realistic about what these other countries collectively what we would be able to do in the absence of the United States. I think the point that Chris was making about binding the US into the region, I think is an incredibly important one. I think it's one that Australia, along with Japan, is very keen to see continue.
Bonnie, exactly. Do you think a bigger role for middle powers will encourage, or have the United States decide, okay, that's been taken care of, and disengage perhaps from the region?
Well, that depends, of course, on who our next president is in part, and I expect that there will be a reassertion of interest in working with partners and allies if Vice President Biden is elected, and we don't know what would happen in the second Trump administration. I don't think we're going to see a complete U.S. withdrawal from the Indo-Pacific region. What we see are a series of contradictory steps and signals under this administration. If it's okay with you, I'd like to briefly address a couple of the questions that were asked. As I see we're running out of time, Dave Finkelstein had asked me about whether there could be a reset in the U.S.-China relationship, indeed whether the Chinese expect that. I think that for the last few years, Americans have been telling the Chinese that there's a consensus in Washington, D.C., that China is now a strategic competitor and rival, and that there won't be much of a shift if the Democrats come back to power. So I think that the Chinese are rather pessimistic about a reset, but they do hope that there might be some areas of cooperation. It might be on pandemics, it might be on global warming, but I think that they are generally pessimistic. They look at the same public opinion polls. American attitudes towards China are certainly going in a negative direction. And as we go through the next 6 months of the US campaign, both Trump and Biden are going to be positioning themselves as very, very tough on China. This will be, it will make it even more challenging to reset the relationship. So I don't think that the Chinese are ruled that out, but I don't think that they believe it's likely. And then very quickly on Taiwan, we certainly shouldn't say there will necessarily be a crisis in the near term or even in 2049. The risks are growing of some crisis. We should recognize that there are many actors and variables that are contributing to the instability in the US-China-Taiwan relationship. I think that the Chinese are a very important factor in that their military, diplomatic, economic pressure on Taiwan has been growing, stealing Taiwan's diplomatic partners, and their exercises, including flying large numbers of aircraft across the Taiwan Strait, and even locking on, in one case, to a Taiwanese fighter jet, are very, very provocative, and the United States is responding to those. The United States is also a variable, and there are steps that the United States has taken that China sees as destabilizing as well. And Chinese are worried that the United States is simply paying lip service to a one China policy, not really adhering to the understandings that were reached between Beijing and Washington in the 3 communiques. And then finally, the question, of course, is what about Taiwan? And in the near term, I believe that President Tsai Ing-wen has a very strong track record of adhering to what she sees as the status quo and not being provocative. But I think if we look out over in the future years, what the Chinese are worried about is somebody more radical potentially comes to power who could pursue de jure independence. They are worried about some of the individuals, indeed, who are in Tsai Ing-wen's administration. And they are worried about the weakness of the opposition, the KMT, and whether they will be able to pose going forward put forward a potential challenger that could bring the KMT back to power after the next 4 years. So all 3 actors are very important in determining whether or not there will be stability in the cross-strait and US-China-Taiwan relationship going forward.
Thanks, thank you. And thank you to all our panelists. I'd like to hand back to Tim now to close the session, given that we're quickly running out of time.
Thank you, Lynn. That was a really great, wide-ranging question and answer session. I'm really grateful to our 6 panelists, Bonnie, Chris, Brendan, Ewan, Aaron, Douglas, for speaking so eloquently about the substance of their chapters for this latest regional security assessment, and for responding so thoroughly and persuasively to that wide range of questions from our participants. I'd also like to thank all those who've participated in this launch for the RSA. It wouldn't have been a launch without a good audience. You've been terrific, and you put forward some excellent questions. And I hope you all really enjoy reading the Regional Security Assessment. Our work on that publication is now done, but the Shangri-La dialogue process continues, and at the IISS we'll soon start work on planning next year's Shangri-La dialogue, and we look forward to seeing many of you as participants in what we plan to be a major relaunch of the dialogue in 2021. Thank you again for joining us, and all best wishes.